You're seeing it everywhere, aren't you? This question about Trump's tariffs,
Huh.
are they the thing that finally pushes us into a recession?
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic. People are even calling it the Trump session.
Right, the Trump session. And you see the stock market reacting, getting jittery.
Well, and it's not just the market. We're hearing about big retailers, Zara, American Eagle. They're saying consumer spending is down.
And companies like Joe, et cetera, going bankrupt. So you're likely seeing these headlines too and wondering, okay, what's really going on here?
Exactly.
And that's what we want to do today. Really dive into this connection, tariffs, recession risk, and maybe get beyond just the surface noise. We've got some interesting perspectives, including from George Gammon.
Yeah, Gammon's take is quite interesting. He starts with this idea of uncertainty, just the threat of tariffs, let alone the reality, creates so much unpredictability.
How does he illustrate that?
He's using this great analogy, importer Ian. Imagine you're Ian, right? You import goods. One day, tariffs are announced. The next day, maybe they're walked back or delayed. How do you plan?
It sounds impossible.
Well, yeah. Let's say Ian thinks a new tariff might double his costs. Just simple numbers. Say a $100 input cost goes to $200. What does he do?
Okay, so Ian's stuck. Does he buy a ton of stuff now to beat the tariff?
Maybe. That's front running. But what if the tariff doesn't happen? Or it gets reversed?
Then he's got a warehouse full of expensive inventory he might not be able to sell easily.
Exactly. And like you mentioned with Joe, etc., making that wrong bet, well, it can sink a business.
So that uncertainty has real consequences right away for businesses.
And it doesn't stop there. It ripples out. Gammon brings in investor Ike.
Okay, another character.
Right. So think about average Joe. Maybe Joe wants to buy a truck, a Canadian-made truck.
Okay.
And there's talk of, say, a 25% tariff on those. So a $100,000 truck suddenly looks like it might cost $125,000.
Right.
Now, Ike is the lender. He's looking at this potential loan for Joe. Ike has to think, if this tariff gets slapped on, fine, but what if it's removed tomorrow?
Ah, the value of the truck, the collateral, suddenly drops back down.
Precisely. So does that make Ike hesitant to lend the full $100,000? Or maybe only lend against a lower value? It makes it harder for Joe to get that truck.
And this is where it really hits home for, well, everyone listening. Because Gammon points out it's not just businesses and lenders feeling nervous.
No, it's consumers, too. Think about the news cycle. If all you hear is recession risk, tariffs bad, economy slowing.
Yeah, you naturally get worried. You, average Joe, start thinking twice about that big purchase, maybe even just eating out less.
Exactly. And if you pull back spending at Ian's business, this XYZ corporation,
Then Ian has less revenue.
which could mean layoffs. See how it connects.
Yeah, it's a chain reaction.
And here's a slightly counterintuitive thing Gammon mentions. The trade deficit might actually go up initially.
How does that work? More tariffs should mean fewer imports, right?
You'd think so. But remember importer Ian. If he's trying to front-run potential tariffs.
Ah, he buys more stuff from overseas now before the tariff hits.
Right, so imports temporarily surge. And then he needs somewhere to put all that extra inventory. Think warehousing costs givens. Gammon mentions AIG warehouse as just an example. More costs pile up.
So more costs, more uncertainty. It links back to that quote from Lynette Zhang, doesn't it? A confused mind always says no.
That's a great connection. When consumers who are, 70% of the U.S. economy feel confused or uncertain, they tend to hold back.
Spending drops. Aggregate demand falls.
And that's a classic path towards economic contraction. Gammon calls this whole thing a potential doom loop.
Explain that loop again.
Okay, so tariffs create uncertainty. That uncertainty distorts economic decisions like Ian buying too much inventory or Ike being hesitant to lend.
Right.
Those distortions then create more economic problems, maybe slow growth or layoffs, which feeds back into more uncertainty.
And the cycle continues, potentially spiraling towards a recession.
That's the idea. It becomes this self-feeding loop of doubt.
Okay, so that paints a pretty clear picture. Tariffs equal uncertainty equals potential recession. But you said Gammon challenges this.
He does. He argues that blaming a potential recession only on the tariffs might be missing, a much bigger picture.
What's the bigger picture then?
He gets into monetary policy. Specifically, he brings up Milton Friedman and the interest rate fallacy.
The interest rate fallacy? Okay, what's that about?
Well, the common idea is low interest rates mean easy money, right? Stimulus for the economy.
Yeah, cheaper to borrow, so people spend more.
But Friedman argued, not necessarily. Sometimes low rates can actually signal tight money and a weak economy.
How can low rates mean tight money? That seems contradictory.
Gammon clarifies Friedman wasn't just talking about the Fed's target rate, but about money conditions within the banking system.
Oh,
Think about it. If banks expect slow growth and maybe even deflation ahead, they get nervous. Even if the Fed's rate is low, banks might become very reluctant to actually lend money out because they see higher risks.
so lending dries up, even with low official rates. That's tight money.
Exactly. Low rates reflect low expectations, leading to tight conditions.
Okay, interesting. How does Gammon connect this to today?
He looks back at the Fed funds rate cycles, starting around 1990,
Mm.
and he points out a pattern.
Which year?
Rate-cutting cycles when the Fed is lowering interest rates have often come before recessions hit. Think 1990, the dot-com bust, the GFC, the S&L crisis.
So the Fed starts cutting rates, and then a recession happens.
Often,
Yeah.
yes. And critically, Gammon notes the current rate-cutting cycle began back in September 2024.
September 2024. That's before all this intensified talk about Trump's potential new tariffs really took off, right?
That's his point. The Fed was already easing policy before the tariff discussion dominated the headlines again.
He also mentioned the pre-Greenspan era with Volcker.
Yeah, briefly, just noting that back then the focus was more on money supply, not targeting a specific rate, which led to wilder rate swings. But even going back to the 50s, he says, rates generally fall during contractions because growth and inflation expectations plummet.
But what about the mid-90s? Greenspan cut rates then, and we didn't get a recession.
But an anomaly. Gammon addresses that. He contrasts it with today. He points out that back in the mid-90s, unemployment didn't really spike up beforehand.
Okay.
And crucially, we didn't have the entire yield curve inverted for a long period like we have seen over the last, 3 years or so.
Right, the inverted yield curve. That's often seen as a recession warning sign.
A pretty reliable one, historically.
Uh,
And that leads to another indicator Gammon mentions. He calls it a kind of PS rule, but not by that specific name here.
What's the pattern?
The unemployment rate. It often starts to tick upwards, to trend higher, before the recession officially starts.
And is that happening now?
Well, he points out the unemployment rate has been generally trending higher since about May 2023.
May 2023. Again, that's well before this recent focus on the potential impact of future tariffs.
Exactly. So Gammon's putting these pieces together. You've got the Fed cutting rates since late 2024, you've had an inverted yield curve for years, and you've got unemployment trending up since mid-2023.
All signs pointing towards potential economic trouble, predating the heavy tariff talk.
That's his argument. These factors suggest a slowdown might have been baked in the cake already, irrespective of the tariff situation.
But he's not saying the tariffs have no impact.
No, not at all. He definitely acknowledges that the uncertainty and the economic distortions caused by tariffs, all that stuff we talked about with Ian and I, that can absolutely make any existing weakness worse. It can exacerbate the downturn.
So the takeaway for someone listening seems to be, it's complicated.
Very. Blaming a potential recession just on tariffs looks like an oversimplification when you consider these other factors, Gammon highlights.
It means you really need to look at the underlying monetary conditions, the yield curve, unemployment trends,
Yeah,
things that were already flashing warning signs.
absolutely. But that uncertainty piece from the tariffs is still important. It's real.
It's like the groundwork for a slowdown might have already been laid, but the tariff uncertainty could definitely make things worse, maybe faster or deeper.
That seems to be Gammon's perspective.
Yeah.
The uncertainty is like throwing gasoline on embers that were already glowing.
Okay, so that really shifts the perspective. Considering all this then, what are the key things you, the listener, should be watching now?
That's the real question, isn't it?
Do you focus just on the tariff news? Or are you digging into those broader indicators, interest rate directions, jobless claims, the yield curve's behavior?
It definitely gives you something more to chew on beyond just the day-to-day headlines about potential trade wars.
Food for thought, for sure. How do you weigh these different forces at play? Something to keep thinking about.